He rarely said he loved me. He wasn't the type to complain or vent either. So the moment I saw Julian sitting in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheels so tight his knuckles went white, his breath broken like he was trying to swallow some kind of pain, I froze. He kept his head down, his shoulders shaking a little, his eyes red but still trying to stay silent. No sobs, no words, just a collapse trying to hide itself in the dark. I stood there at the garage door. I didn't step forward. I didn't call his name. I just watched, as if touching that moment would shatter it into pieces we'd never be able to put back together. To understand why that scene sent a chill down my spine, I have to go back a few months. Back when things between us still seemed fine, at least on the surface. At that time, our marriage looked calm, in a way many people would wish for. I was the kind of woman who stayed steady, handled emotions well, and didn't make a big deal out of things unless I understood the whole picture. Julian was different. He was introverted, quiet, but so responsible that it sometimes turned into a burden he carried alone. Everything he did was careful, on time, and for the family. I used to think that steadiness was what held our home together. I had no idea how tightly he had to hold himself every single day. In the early years of our marriage, our routine was simple. He handled the heavy things, I handled the small things at home. When something bothered me, I said it out loud. He kept everything inside. I used to think that was just his nature. A lot of American men grow up thinking they have to be strong, quiet, and deal with things on their own. I got used to that and never asked him to become someone else. But in the past few months, I started noticing silences that were longer than usual. At first, they were tiny, small enough that I thought I was overthinking. But the longer you live with someone, the sharper your intuition gets. Julian began avoiding serious conversations. Anytime I asked, "How's work going lately?" he answered so fast it didn't mean anything. "Good." The answer came out with no pause, no glance, nothing. It felt like a reflex he'd practiced for years. Some nights he came home late. No explanation. I didn't confront him, I just observed. He walked into the kitchen, set his keys on the table, gave me a quick kiss on the forehead, and said the line I could recite by heart. "I'm good." But that good was hollow. It didn't carry the weight of truth, only the weight of avoiding it. I remember one night at dinner. I was sharing a few small things from my day, the kind of things that would normally make him smile or say something back. But that night he wasn't really there. His eyes were on me, but his mind felt miles away. When I paused to give him space to respond, he just gave a small nod and kept eating, like opening his mouth any further might let something slip out. I didn't blame him. I just started to feel a chill inside. The nights grew longer for him. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see the living room light still on. Julian would be sitting in a corner, back straight, hands clasped, eyes on the floor. No phone, no TV, just silence. When I walked out, he turned away fast, said, "Couldn't sleep," then told me to go back to bed or I'd get cold. I didn't believe that explanation, but I didn't push either. Some mornings he stood in front of the mirror a long time, fixing his shirt over and over, even though nothing was wrong with it. Little signs like that kept piling up. From a few inches away, they started to feel like miles. One day he came home and went straight to his office. When I walked past the door, I saw him looking at our family budget, then shutting the screen fast when he heard my steps. He tried to smile at me, but the smile was thin, like a light mist that couldn't cover the weight sitting on his chest. I also noticed him avoiding calls from coworkers. His phone would buzz. He'd look at the name, then flip it face down. Every time I gently asked, "Everything okay?" And every time, the same answer, "I'm fine." A reply that was becoming more useless by the day. We used to tell each other that marriage didn't need a lot of words, just a lot of presence. But his presence lately was too silent. I didn't need him to tell me everything. I just needed him not to build a wall between us. But I knew if I pressed any further, he'd close up like an automatic door. Then came the nights when he stopped touching me. Not because he didn't love me anymore, but because his mind was busy trying to survive something I still didn't understand. I can tell when a man pulls inward. He's not avoiding you, he's avoiding the world. By then, I was starting to worry, but I chose to watch instead of pushing him to talk. I knew he was the kind of person who wouldn't open up until he hit a breaking point. I just didn't know how close that point was. All those small signs, the long silences, the forced smiles, they all led to that night. When I saw Julian sitting alone in the car, his hands gripping tight, like he was holding on to the last thing keeping him upright. I didn't say his name. I didn't tap on the window. I just watched. And in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. Something was very wrong, and it wasn't going to disappear on its own. That night, after seeing Julian break down in the car, I didn't ask anything. I walked into the house first to give him time to pull himself together. And just as I expected, a few minutes later, he came in looking so normal that anyone else would have had no idea what had just happened. He kissed my cheek and said he was late because of traffic. I just nodded. I didn't mention what I'd seen. But from that moment on, everything looked clearer to me, like a fog had finally lifted. In the days that followed, Julian started coming home late more often. No real reason. No anger or exhaustion on his face. He just walked in wearing a slightly wrinkled shirt, set his bag down, and said the same line, "I'm good." I watched every small movement. He still changed clothes like he always did, but his motions were stiff. He still sat at the table for dinner, but after a few spoonfuls he stopped. Like someone who couldn't feel whether he was hungry or full anymore. At night, he didn't sleep deeply. I felt him turning again and again. Whenever I opened my eyes, he was already awake, but when I asked, he only said, "It's nothing, go back to sleep." Over and over, a sentence that grew emptier each time. I didn't push him to talk, I just watched. And the more I watched, the clearer the imbalance between us became. Before, if I touched his shoulder, he'd respond with a look or a small squeeze of my hand. Now he barely reacted. He didn't pull away from me, but he didn't take me in either. It was a quiet kind of distance, and a real one. Evenings used to be filled with talk about our day, a new movie, or random little things. Lately, whenever I started a story, he answered with the shortest replies possible, like he was trying to complete the minimum requirement of being part of a conversation. Sometimes I stopped halfway just to see if he'd notice. Most of the time, he didn't. He only let out a sigh he didn't even realize he made. One weekend afternoon, I walked into the living room and found him looking at our bank accounts. Not for the first time. It was the third time I'd seen him do that in a week. But every time I got close, he shut the screen fast, like a reflex. I didn't need to see the numbers to know he was carrying a worry he refused to share. Being the one who held everything together was a role he tightened around himself in a way only men who pushed too hard would understand. Financial pressure wasn't new to us, but his silence turned it into an underground storm. I could see he was calculating something, cutting expenses, checking bills, going over every small charge. But he didn't say a word. Then one day his phone rang. A coworker's name showed up. Julian stared at the screen for a long time like he was weighing what to do. In the end, he let it ring out. I asked softly, "Why didn't you answer?" He said, "It's nothing." But his face gave him away. This wasn't the usual kind of avoidance. This was the kind of avoidance you see in someone who doesn't want to face what they already know. From that day on, he barely mentioned work. No updates on projects, no stories about anyone at the office. With Julian, silence was the clearest sign that something was wrong. I knew there was something bigger behind it, but he kept his mouth shut like saying it out loud would make things worse. Day by day, the distance between us kept growing. Not through arguments or coldness you could point to, but through silences that lasted too long. Sometimes I felt like I was living next to a shadow, not the man I married. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. Next to me, Julian lay perfectly still, but his breathing was too steady. The kind of breathing people use when they're pretending to sleep. I stayed quiet for a moment, listening to the tension in his body. When I moved a little closer, he immediately turned his back to me, creating just enough distance to seem unintentional, but clear enough for me to understand he didn't want anyone touching him. The air in the room felt pressed down, thick, heavy, and tight. I looked at his back. It was the posture of a man who'd always tried to stand strong for his family, now curled inward like he was hiding a deep wound. He didn't speak, but his body did. It was an SOS signal he still buried under the blankets. I lay still and stayed quiet. But inside I had a clear feeling. Julian was sliding into a place he couldn't climb out of on his own. And the scariest part wasn't what he was going through, but that he believed he had to go through it alone. I turned my face toward the ceiling and breathed out softly. The part of me that listens to things no one says whispered, "This isn't small. And it's getting close to the edge." I didn't know when that limit would come. I only knew that every night he turned his back in silence, I felt us drift a little farther apart. And I understood, in the coldest way, that things were only beginning to crack. I knew Julian was breaking, but I didn't know how wide the fracture had grown until that morning. He left the house earlier than usual, said he had an important meeting. His voice was steady, his face calm, but his eyes avoided mine for just a beat. Just one small beat, but enough for me to know there was something he didn't want me to see. That night, I went out to the garage to grab something from the car. And that's when I saw him. In a moment no one was ever meant to witness from a man who always tried to be strong. Julian sat still behind the wheel. Car lights off, doors closed, no radio, no sound. Just him, wrapped in the dark. His head hung over his hands, shoulders dropped like he was trying to hold off the whole world with one thin breath. I stood there, no knocking, no calling his name, just watching. I saw his body shake in waves, but there were no sobs. He didn't allow himself to make a sound. Every bit of strength he had left was in those hands gripping the wheel, like if he let go, he'd fall apart completely. I didn't think I'd ever seen him that weak. And I never thought I would. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and tired. I stepped back so he wouldn't know I had seen everything, but he had already seen me. And in the moment our eyes met, Julian froze, like someone caught doing something terribly wrong. I opened the garage door and moved aside so he could walk into the house first. Neither of us said a word. When the door closed behind him, I took a deep breath and followed. He sat down on the couch. His hands were clasped, his palms still shaking a little. I stood across from him. I didn't move closer. I didn't wrap my arms around him. I didn't ask if he was okay, because clearly that question would only make him shut down. I said one thing, short, cold. "Julian, when did this start?" He looked up. His eyes wavered for 1 second, like he was choosing between hiding a little longer or letting the truth break out on its own. He didn't answer right away. No excuses, no explanations. Just silence. A silence so heavy I knew for certain he had reached his limit. After a long moment, he exhaled hard, like someone who had finally stopped running. 3 weeks ago, he said. His voice was dry and low, as if every word carried the weight he'd been holding all this time. I stayed still, waiting for him to continue. The company started cutting people. At first it was just rumors. Everyone thought they'd keep the senior positions. A pause. I thought so too. That last sentence shifted the whole mood in the room. "So," I asked, my voice steady, "I'm on the list to be let go." Everything in the room seemed to stop. No breeze, no cars outside, just the truth falling between us. Julian lowered his head and pressed a hand to his forehead. "They told me directly. No warning. I didn't know how to face it. Didn't know how to tell you." I let him speak. I didn't cut in. Since then, I've been trying to look for new openings, trying to keep my routine, trying to make sure you wouldn't notice anything. He let out a thin laugh, the kind people make when they've hit the bottom. But the more I tried, the more I failed. The financial pressure, the bills, our family plans, the responsibilities on both sides, all of it had flooded his mind like a storm. I could see it in the way his hands tightened. I thought, if I told you, you'd be disappointed. I lost the position I spent years building. I felt like I wasn't a real man in this house anymore. His voice cracked, though he tried to hold it together. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, soft but sharp, "Julian, what made me feel distant from you wasn't that you lost your job. It was that you thought I was too small to share it with." He looked up, his eyes widening a little. I continued, "I don't need you to be strong all the time. I just need you to be honest when you're about to fall. No blame. No, you were wrong. Just the truth." The thing he'd been avoiding. Julian let his hands drop, like the last bit of strength holding him up had been pulled away. "I don't know how to let someone hold me," he said. "All I know is how to stand, and the longer I stand, the more it hurts. But it never crossed my mind that you'd want to stand with me." I said nothing. In that moment, I didn't need to. He leaned back on the couch, eyes drifting somewhere far away, and in a voice barely above a whisper, I'm tired, Mariah. Not because I lost my job, but because I'd been pretending to be okay for too long. I took one small step toward him, but kept just enough distance so he wouldn't feel cornered. Julian, I said, if you keep carrying this alone, you're going to lose everything, before I even get the chance to help you. Those words made him close his eyes. Not from pain, but from relief. Relief in the way someone finally feels when they set down a weight they were never strong enough to hold on their own. That night, for the first time in weeks, Julian didn't turn his back to me. He sat upright, his hands trembling slightly, and let the silence speak for everything he still didn't know how to say out loud. He broke, not because he lost his job, but because for the first time in years, he was seen all the way through. And when a person is seen to their core, there's usually nothing left to hide. That's the moment you hit bottom. And it's also where things start to turn. When Julian finally said everything he'd been holding back, I didn't ask for more. I didn't comfort him. I didn't wrap him in a blanket of, "It's going to be okay." I knew those lines don't help. Someone standing on the edge doesn't need a hug. They need solid ground under their feet. I chose to be that ground, not soft, not sentimental, just steady. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The kitchen was quiet. No sound of Julian moving around like he always did. I looked around the house and realized it mirrored his state of mind. Things pushed into corners, papers left in stacks, the air heavier than it should be. I didn't clean everything for him. I just started placing essential things where they belonged, clearing a path so he could breathe again. When Julian came downstairs, his eyes still swollen, he looked around and paused at the piles of paperwork I had sorted. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know," I cut in softly. "I'm just making space so you can see things more clearly." I sat down and turned my chair toward him. "Julian," I said, "what do you want for yourself, not what you think you're supposed to do?" He leaned back a little, like the question had touched a part of him he'd kept hidden too long. He stayed quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I don't know. I've been running after obligations for so long that when I finally stopped, I couldn't tell where I was standing anymore." I nodded without adding anything. Asking the question was my part. Answering it was his. From that day on, our rhythm changed. Not into a prettier, more polished version of us, but into something slower and more honest. Julian started taking morning walks. Not running, he didn't have the strength, just short loops around the neighborhood. I joined him the first few times, staying one step behind so he'd feel my presence without feeling watched. Whenever he stopped halfway, I didn't say, "Keep going." I just stood there, waiting until he was ready. He also ate more regularly, even if food didn't always taste like anything. I made simple meals. He sat across from me, eating little but finishing what was on his plate, not leaving it half done the way he used to. The biggest change wasn't in his habits, but in the way he finally started to open up. One night he said, "This morning I woke up and couldn't catch my breath." I just replied, "I'm listening." No analysis, no trying to dress up his pain, just giving him a place to set it down. Little by little, he learned to admit he was tired, that some days he didn't want to get out of bed, that the fear of not being good enough dragged him down every time he opened his laptop to look for a new job. He said those things without his hands shaking. I looked at him and saw something clearly. When people are allowed to be a little weak, they become much stronger. We started having conversations again, short ones but real. No defenses, no empty, "I'm fine." "I'm scared you'll see me differently," he said one night at dinner. I set my fork down. I don't need a man who never falls. I need a man who knows how to get back up with me. He looked at me for a long time like he was relearning how to believe it. Some days were the same as before, long silences, his mood sinking. But the difference was this. He didn't disappear into that silence anymore. He told me when he was tired. He told me when he didn't want to talk. And that was enough to keep me from having to guess in the dark. We rebuilt our connection without romantic gestures, no flowers, no long apologies, just small actions, done at the right moments. A meal he cooked part of, a book he set on my desk because he knew I'd like it, an evening watching the news with his hand resting lightly on mine, steady, not forced. Those moments weren't loud, but they were real. Then, a few weeks later, he got a call. Someone he used to work with asked if he wanted to join a new project. The pay wasn't as high as his old job, but it was stable and matched his real skills, not the role he had forced himself to hold on to. I saw his expression change as he listened. Not happiness. Relief. But when he hung up, he turned to me. "This time," he said, "you know everything from the start." I just nodded. But inside, I knew that was the real sign of recovery. Not because he had a new opportunity, but because he chose to share it the moment it came. That afternoon, while we cleared his desk together, I noticed something I hadn't seen in months. Julian stood a little straighter. Not because his confidence was fully back, but because he wasn't carrying all the weight alone anymore. Our marriage didn't turn into a fairy tale after that. There was no moment where everything magically became perfect again. But we stepped out of the dark into a place with a bit of light. And this time, he didn't walk there alone. And for me, that was enough to know that the break we went through didn't destroy us. It just forced us to see each other more clearly. It became more real. Real in a way where there were no blurry spaces between us. No more, "I'm fine," used to cover cracks that were spreading. Julian stopped trying to build a wall between us. He told me when he was worried. He told me when he was scared. And I no longer had to read every silence to figure out where I stood. His change wasn't loud. He didn't turn into some transformed man after a crisis. He just showed up more. A little bit each day. He looked me in the eye more when we talked. His answers weren't clipped anymore. He still wasn't free from the defenses he'd carried for years, but he no longer hid inside silence. And to me, that was the biggest step he had ever taken. One morning, before the sunlight had fully reached the kitchen, Julian set his glass of water on the table and looked at me. No build-up, no tension, just the quiet of two people who had gone through the hardest part and were still here. "I can't promise I'll always be strong," he said, his voice low but steady, "but I promise I won't stay silent anymore." His words weren't loud, they weren't a vow. But they made me pause. Because for the first time in years, Julian chose honesty over trying to look steady. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a promise to become perfect. It was simply an admission, and that admission carried more weight than any healing speech could. I looked at him and saw a man who wasn't at his strongest and wasn't at his weakest, just his truest. We went on living our ordinary married life, but without things buried in silence. When he was tired, he said it. When I was worried, I said it. No guessing. No one carrying the dark alone. One night I asked him, "Are you afraid this could happen again?" Julian thought for a moment, then said, "Yeah. But this time, at least I'm not afraid you'll leave if I tell you the truth." I didn't answer with reassurance. I just placed my hand on his. A small gesture, but enough for him to understand that his breaking point wasn't something I used to measure his worth. What we went through didn't turn into a lesson or a movie-perfect storyline. Real life doesn't work like that. But it showed me something I used to doubt. Two people are truly together. Not when everything goes well, but when one of them hits bottom and the other doesn't turn away. I think about the months Julian pushed himself so hard he barely recognized who he was anymore. About the nights he turned his back to me, believing silence would protect him from feeling like a failure. About the moment he collapsed in the car, gripping the steering wheel like it was the last thing he had to hold on to. That moment once chilled me, because it revealed the truth he'd been hiding. Julian wasn't okay, and he hadn't been okay for a long time before he said it out loud. Looking back now, I don't see that moment as an ending. Not as a sign that our marriage had cracked beyond repair. It was the first moment he let go of a weight he no longer had the strength to carry. And because he let go, I finally had the chance to step in. Many people think strength is about standing firm without shaking, but I learned something different from the man who once held himself together so tightly he could barely breathe. Strength isn't about never falling. Strength is knowing when to speak. And in a marriage, what keeps two people together isn't perfection or constant toughness. It's not leaving when one person breaks. It's standing at the edge with them and saying, "You don't have to stand on your own." On a weekend evening, we walked around the neighborhood. We didn't hold hands right away, didn't talk much. We just walked beside each other in the same rhythm. When we reached the familiar corner, Julian held out his hand. Not to ask for forgiveness, just to show me he was here, truly here. I placed my hand in his, and in that moment I saw clearly. Our marriage didn't become easier. It became steadier, because we no longer had to guess in the dark about each other. And as we kept walking, I thought of him crying in the car, a moment that once looked like the end of everything. But it turned out to be just a comma. The line between the part of our marriage he tried to hold by himself and the part he finally let me step into. It wasn't an ending. It was where we started again. More honest, more mature, and strong enough to keep going together. Strength doesn't come from never falling. It comes from speaking up when you can't stand anymore. And sometimes, what keeps a marriage standing isn't perfection, but honesty at the right moment. That's the end of the story. Thank you for listening all the way through. If you've ever felt something similar, what moment made the two of you finally understand each other better? Leave a comment. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to follow and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Thank you for your support. Your presence always means a lot to me.